So we're going to look at the Desmos on complex numbers. So if you open it up, start with the warm-up. We're just solving these 4 problems and we're solving for x. So go ahead and pause the video and try on your own and then resume and check your answers. Alrighty, so solving this for x means that I need to take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x squared and the square root of 16. But as we have learned, when you square root both sides like I just did, you also need to include the plus or minus symbol, which we have come to realize isn't easy to type in. So if you want to just do the plus and minus like that, that works. So anyways, square root both sides, plus or minus. So your answer then is plus or minus 4. Or you can just say x equals 4 and negative 4. Either way, you cover your bases. It's fine by me. Okay, question number 2. This time it's x squared plus 2 equals negative 34. X squared isn't by itself like it was before. So this time I'm going to need to subtract 2 from both sides and I get negative 36. I'm going to square root both sides. And remember, square root both sides means I need to do plus or minus. And I notice that I get plus or minus the square root of negative 36. Well, alarm bells should be going off because there is no real solution when you square root a negative number. If you look at number 3, you'll realize we end up with the same scenario where it's x squared equals negative 25. So yet again, no real solution. The 4th problem, we get x squared minus 4 equals 5. Well, I'm going to add 4 to both sides, and I get 9. Square root both sides. Don't forget plus or minus. And we get x equals plus or minus 3. Now, notice how I say no real solution. Not just no solution, no real solution. This is what we're getting at today. Why is it no real solution? Well, the reason I say no real solution is because there's actually a complex solution. And what the complex solution is, it's kind of a bigger family. So you have real numbers, which are just a part of complex numbers. So all our solutions have been falling in this real numbers family, but now we're going to look at the solutions that fall on the outside of the bigger complex number family. And as you can see, right, the way complex numbers work is you have a real part and an imaginary part. So we've been only looking at the real part, but now we're going to bring in the imaginary part. And what this imaginary part is it's connected to that square root of negative 1, right? So whenever we see that negative under the square root. And the imaginary number I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So we're going to use the fact that I equals the square root of negative 1 to simplify these problems into complex solutions that are also going to get rid of the negative under the square root. So if we look at this example, we have x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 25. Well, before we would say no real solution, can't have a negative under the square root, but now we can change our equation, move some things around, so we can get to our complex solution with our imaginary piece. And watch how I do that. So negative 25 is going to split into a positive 25 and a negative 1. The reason I do that is because 25 times negative 1 is negative 25. So it's still the same thing underneath the square root. I just broke it into 2 different numbers. And the reason that's helpful is because when I end up with the square root of negative 1, well, we just talked about how the fact that that's I. So I can yet again split it up into the square root of 25, the square root of negative 1, And that allows me to now replace that square root of -1 with an I. So I've now gotten rid of the negative under the square root, the negative under the square root of 25, and it now just becomes replaced with I on the outside. And again, the I comes from this square root of -1 that we split apart. Last step is just to simplify the square root of 25, which would just be 5. So notice I have my real part of 3 and my imaginary part of 5i. You do not have to do this second and third step I did in here every single time. That's more showing you how we go from square root of -25 down to the square root of 25i. As you get more familiar with it, this jump is going to become a lot easier, so you don't have to show those steps every single time. Let's take a look at some examples of working with this imaginary number. Look here at slide 3. For this first problem, we have x plus 2 equals the square root of -36. Well, I got to get x by itself because I'm solving for x. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides, and I get square root of -36 minus 2. Well, we're just going to go line by line, simplifying it until we can't simplify it anymore. X equals square root of, now I'm going to separate it into 36 and the square root of -1. Again, if this makes sense to you and you want to go from the first line to this line, I'm fine with that, as long as you understand why. So what did I just do? Well, remember, we just talked about how I is the square root of -1. So I simply replace square root of -1 with I. Once again, we can simplify this further. And instead of square root of 36, right, we can just put 6. 6i minus 2. Now I'm close but not quite, because complex form is a, the real part, plus the imaginary part. Right now I have the imaginary part plus the real part. So I just need to rearrange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my a, which is -2, and I'm just going to move it out in front, and then my b, I, which is +6, I is just going to go at the end. So just rearranging it into that complex form. And that's it. I cannot combine -2 and 6i because they are not like terms. Just like I wouldn't be able to combine -2 plus 6x, I can't combine -2 plus 6i. So this would be the furthest I can go, and this would be my answer for x. Notice how in this problem, the square root was already in the problem and it was already listed as positive. When you're already given the square root, like in number 1, we're not concerned with plus or minus. The only time we're concerned with plus or minus is in scenario 2, where we have to square root both sides. So go ahead and pause the video and try number 2 on your own. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to have to square root both sides in number 2. And when we square root both sides, we get plus or minus the square root of -100. Well, the negative under the square root is going to send off alarm bells, and that's going to tell us that, okay, I'm going to have to use imaginary numbers. So plus or minus the square root of 100i. Now, notice how the I is currently underneath the square root. We can't have that. You got to move the I to the outside. Got to move it to the outside. And last, we can simplify this yet again to be plus or minus 10i. This would be your final answer. Notice there is no a value. Well, there is an a value, but it's actually just 0. So this right here, your 10i is that b piece. your A would be 0, but we don't have to include that. So plus or minus 10, that would be your final answer for this problem.